With defeat by Iran at the quarter-final stage, China's Asian Cup run came to an end. And with that also came the end of a job for the Italian Marcello Lippi, who had been managing the Chinese national team for more than 2 years. So how should this performance by Team China be evaluated? Why, despite many years of a heavy investment in the domestic league, does the national team continue to struggle at the highest level? And what are the prospects for the rest of the Asian Cup competition? To take a closer look at the Chinese football and this year's Asian Cup, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Paul Dong, co-founder of A China Limited, and Rowan Simons, chairman of China Club Football FC. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Rowan and Paul, China lost to Iran 0-3, but no one was surprised in China. Why?
Because in terms of the ranking position of the Chinese national team in the world by FIFA, and also in terms of their recent performances, and of course, if you have the expertise to evaluate players against other teams, and you know where your target is. And actually, China set the target for itself to finish into the quarterfinals, but not into the semifinals. They eventually finished number 6 in Asia, and that's quite a fair outcome. That's where they're supposed to stay.
So we arrived where we should be. Are you surprised?
No, I think Paul said it right. That is the level that China's at now. Iran is a very strong team, one of the strongest teams in Asia. In the game, they showed a lot more fight. I think they took opportunities when they presented themselves, and it's the right time for China to be leaving the competition.
Chinese football players have been weak for years. But what about the head coach from Italy? His term has expired and he will go back. Do you think he will go back with bitter memories, or he thinks that he has achieved what he wanted 2 years ago?
Well, China has hired 7 or 8 foreign coaches over the last maybe 20 years, but Lippi was supposed to retire from football and also end his contract with China, more moderately, instead of in the mood of being extremely angry that night after China lost to Iran. Because as he said, it was not the way for China to lose. He didn't expect his team to perform too well over the best in Asia, but losing that game in that way in 3 unforgivable mistakes, and that outraged him so much. It was a very unhappy ending to him.
Then what's wrong with the Chinese defenders?
Well, I mean, these were 3 individual moments. It can happen to any player, I think. One of the things I think is interesting is that the player who is perhaps most guilty has been demoted on his return to his club. That's certainly not the right attitude. Really got to support players. It's almost like missing a penalty. It can happen to anyone, and I think you have to build up the player, encourage them to come again into the game rather than castigate them and then send them to the junior team or the reserve team as a result. That's not the right attitude, and I think that's kind of the pressure that the Chinese players often feel.
You may call those mistakes accidental, but if you look at the entire process, 3-0 was a quite fair outcome, because the Iranian teams actually had more opportunities to score, and they narrowly missed them. And so I don't think it's actually because of accidental mistakes. It was just habitual problems with the players, and probably Lippi had too much expectation in them to upset the Iranians. I mean, to perform even better than their real strength.
For 2 years, Lippi has invested so much of his love, passion, and energy into the national team.
He is also the highest paid coach in the world.
Well, he's got what he wanted, of course, partly because of the high payment. But what about the general investment into the league competitions? Do you think you'll see some hope for the future? Or do you think China has basically lost the hope for football?
Well, China has lost so many crucial games, much bigger than this one, to Iran. But I think this moment, Chinese football fans, especially fans of my age, are doing much more soul-searching than before, because if you look at the younger players and you figure out why Lippi would take so many over 30-year-old players onto his team instead of like Vietnam, Thailand, and some of the Western Asian countries 5 or 6 years younger on average than the Chinese team. That's probably due to the fact, the very harsh fact, that the younger players are not even as strong as this veteran team. And that's the problem.
Physically or in terms of experiences?
In terms of everything, overall skill, because all those younger teams, under 23, under 21, 19, 17, all of them fail to enter into the quarterfinals of the Asian championships for their ages. So you don't see a lot of hope in the younger generation. We can find out actually what went wrong with Chinese football after so many years that the overall level is actually lowering than going higher.
Yeah. Can you give us some hope? Are you optimistic or cautiously optimistic that we do have future?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a future. That's the beauty of sport, isn't it? That we always have a chance to try again, and China has to keep on trying. I think it does face big problems with the aging team, and just as Paul says, the manager has not felt confident in bringing the younger players into the team, and that has to say something about the level that they're at now. But I will return to the same comments I make every time on the show, that this is a long-term process. It's not even under 17s and under 16s. It's under 4, it's under 5, it's under 6. We have to build a new generation in China that have the ability to compete at the highest level, all the way through the levels before we get to the big international competitions. It takes time and patience and effort.
Yeah.
And I must be frank with you, I am not a fan of football culture, football competition. I did watch some of the most exciting games in the tournament, but I'm never so supportive of a cause of football as a cause. So I also take part of the blame. I must be honest with this issue. So I'm one of the Chinese who collectively contribute to the decline, an irretrievable decline, if I may say so, of the Chinese football team.
Well, I think I appreciate your word investment. I think that's the key word for all parents in China to decide what to do for their children to develop either as a profession in the future or as amateur activity, hobby. But I think that's to answer my own question. How come this younger generation in their early 20s or teenage teams are not even as strong as this team that Lippi just quit, and even much lower than an earlier team, a retired team than this one? Because if you look at the age, this team just finished their quest in the Asian Cup, were born in the 1990s, and then younger players born in the millennials, in the 2000s, and even younger, they were born in a time when China experienced the fastest economic development. And young people born in those years, their number 1 choice or their number 10 choices had very little to do with sports. Very small number of children who saw little hope in developing their career in other options would choose sport. But among all sports, they would choose, as an investment, they would choose the best return, the ones for best return, like ping pong, badminton, diving.
Excuse me, Paul, you may not take football as your career development plan, but you should play it for pleasure, for fun. What's missing, I'm afraid, for the future of China's football performance is the fun itself. It's not just for commercial sakes. It's not for winning medals, right?
This is the difference. So I think there is some hope.
Yeah, the truth is...
Because China, as you say, 20 years ago, I think you're right, people of my age and older used to play football on the streets. It was common in China. That was a fun way to spend your time. In the last 20 years, we've had consumerism, we've had the introduction of social media, there's films, there's shopping, there's so many different distractions for kids.
The one-child family.
And one-child family.
They're concerned about their security. security
But
and everything.
I think what's happening now is that certainly in the big cities, many families have reached a middle class status, and they're returning to the game, and they're looking now for more quality of life, and sports is playing a bigger part of that, and can do in society today. So I think if there is a hope, it's the development in China that we've seen over the last 20 years.
And the other thing that embarrasses us,
I'm
if
not
not shocked us, excuse me, Paul, is the serious lack of football pitches. I mean, given the boom of property development over the past 20 years, nothing has anything to do with perhaps the construction of football pitches. To say nothing of playgrounds for the kids in the school. I mean, most of the kids would be sent to Olympic mathematics classes instead of a football school.
Well, I think I never disagreed with Rowan in terms of the future. I think what he's talking about is we should keep our hope for just in case that in the next 5 or 10 years the national team still doesn't perform very well, but we should keep our hope because the even younger generation of kids, they are coming up, they are enjoying better conditions, and there are more pitches being built nationwide. So the situation is improving, but gradually or slowly, but I'm warning that the next 5 years, you don't see the very out result.
No, you
but
won't.
in the next 10 years, you will see some results.
10 to 15 years, you'll see the
Yeah.
results. But actually, I think there has been another change, and it comes from the President's reform plan. There are a lot more
That's what
football
I want
pitches
to
now.
ask.
Yes,
there are
3 years
more.
ago, President Xi Jinping headed a team to address the issue of football and the performance in China. So what are the reform measures?
Yeah, well, I think, on facility side, there are more pitches now. But what we're still missing is the culture and the infrastructure to use them. So it's
It's
actually...
very much like beer and pubs in Britain, right?
Well,
we don't have such a culture.
There is a club culture in many football nations, and I think that's been missing in China, and that still needs to be developed. But again, the people have the financial, economic, certainly educational abilities now and levels to start forming themselves into clubs and communities. So I think there is hope moving forward, and it does come from the people themselves rather than the government or than sponsorship
So
or
Paul,
large
is that
clubs.
one of the major reasons why you refuse to give up hope for the Chinese football?
Well, I'm not giving up my hope for Chinese football overall. I don't have expectation in the next 3, 5, or even 10 years that you don't realistically expect the national team to do so well, although they bear the expectation from the top state leadership and also the population to qualify into the World Cup, and their very next opportunity would be in Qatar. But that is extremely difficult.
Now, my concern, excuse me, gentlemen, is why, despite the appalling underperformance of the Chinese professional football players, Chinese in their millions would turn out to watch tournaments each time. Without exceptions, they would enjoy beer, they would enjoy cheers, excitement of the
So
in
those moments...
But don't you think such, watching habits should have delivered a huge impact on their passion? They should have that kind of watching a football tournament should be transformed into their zealotry to play football. But why they failed to,
I think, of course, that will generate some impact, the enthusiasm. But if you look at other places like Southeast Asia, the enthusiasm of fanatics about football has always been there for much longer time than football's history in China. But they never produced the right team, because in those moments, football was not much more than an entertainment or for gambling. But to develop into a stronger team, a stronger nation in football, you need to play with your feet.
By the way, corruption. I believe a severe anti-corruption campaign must have been launched to make sure that nothing would go wrong in, money laundering, black whistling. What do we call that? 黑哨. So, do you think the anti-corruption campaign has paid off? How serious is this problem in China, from your observations?
Gambling is the biggest problem facing sport, and not just in China. I'm not aware of any specific cases around this Asian Cup, but it's a huge issue, and it goes to the heart of sport.
Do you think gambling in football industry is a huge industry?
Well, of course, it's well known as an industry. You know, the legal gambling and betting industry is absolutely huge. I mean, certainly from the perspective of grassroots operators, we want to see that regulated and taxed, and see some of the taxes coming back to the game, which at the moment, when it's all illegal, nothing comes back to the game at all. It's all lost.
But that's a problem troubling football overall, not in China in particular. So I think I agree with Rowan that we should introduce it to solve the cultural problem. We should introduce more experienced and very honest coaches and people working for football into China, because these young kids cannot be trained by those who already failed, who didn't know how to play football.
Okay, you have talked about so many issues concerning the future and the vulnerabilities of the Chinese football. What about international players? We spoke of the issue of investment, right? We have money, right? So what? Do you think we can buy the best players, the most brilliant players, so that in most cases we could still feel good? Sam?
It's one route, isn't it? The naturalisation of foreign players. I think, you know, there are rules, there are international rules that each country has about whether someone can become a citizen. Sport has its own rules, particularly for young players, about how long they should be resident in a country. I think if you are following those rules as they exist today, then we shouldn't be saying that a sports or an athlete shouldn't be able to change citizenship for some way. They should have the same rights as any other person. For sure, if top players can be naturalised, it's going to help your football team.
And do you think we should import more of the Africans
to help us
play football?
Are we talking about the so-called naturalised players representing China as a national team?
It could be part of the issue, right? We should have encouraged a policy of immigration such as those from Africa.
But Mr. Young, if we are talking about the football project to evaluate the performance of the Chinese Football Association and all people working for football in China over the last 30 to 40 years, how do we evaluate their performance? I think by importing the naturalized players into the Chinese national team is kind of like secretly changing your objective. You know, it doesn't get you, make you get away with failing to achieve or fulfill your original objective or your original promise. Of course, it's much easier to put together a team of naturalized players.
I don't think this is a very good and healthy international vision. I think it's a matter of how to build hybrid performance.
Well, you know, we have this issue in the UK all the time, for example,
yes.
You know, whether someone will play for Ireland or for Northern Ireland or Scotland or Wales or England, depending on their parentage. I think if you can trace your ancestry through the proper ways and according to the laws of that country, we should not be denying athletes the opportunity to follow citizenship. But if you're talking about literally importing players that have no link with China at all to produce a team that can win the World Cup, then I think that may well go against, you know, China's best long-term interests.
I think we're talking about a much broader subject. I just suspect that sometime if we allow this so-called globalization of players, I think eventually after maybe 30 or 40 years, there will be even fewer, even less Chinese Indians playing on the football pitch. It would be people from Africa, Europe, and Latin America, because they land their jobs. They're naturally stronger and better. And
now, Paul, can I remind you, the internationalization of football players might be yet an interesting aspect, if not a major aspect, of our Belt and Road Initiative, right? We should build more interconnectivity.
All right. Well, it's very easy to put together a team of 11 players from other countries and win something for China.
I think that would actually be illegal under, you know, international law. It would be illegal under China's law as well as sporting law. But naturalized players, I mean, for example, you know, one of the parents is Chinese. I think these are perfectly acceptable ways they're used in sport all the time.
Yeah. But you can't find excuse if you compare yourself with the South Koreans, with Iranians. They are all, you know, native, very naturally native to their own countries. They're doing quite well.
By the way, what's behind the success story of the South Koreans?
All right, let me tell you this. Their budget is controlled, they're managed, and they don't allow the most expensive players play together alongside with much less paced home players on one team, and then their home players gradually developed into the green leaves instead of red flowers. And when the national team put all the best green leaves from the nation into a national team, and when the team was in need for someone to turn things around and score crucial goals, nobody would come up to play the heroic role, because back on their club team, they have been assisting their big international stars to do the main role. And that's exactly what's happening in the Chinese professional league. And almost none of the national players know what to do when the team is falling behind.
Do you agree, Ruben?
It's the truth. China's lacking, real match winners. But you have to say in the end that, football is a meritocracy. I think we've had this issue for a long time in England about the Premier League, impacting on England's national team performance. We have the strongest league and the weakest team. That's no longer true. And the England national team has really come back in the World Cup last year. And at the junior levels, you can see an incredible progression. That's also happened in the Premier League. In the end, the players have to make their place on merit. And so China does need players who can replace the foreign stars at that top level. It hasn't got them. It's going to take years to develop them. But that has to be the way, rather than saying China should not have foreign players and then reduce the whole level of the
I
league.
never said China shouldn't have foreign players, because Mr. Yang Rui asked me about the Korean remedy. I said on each Korean team, club team, there are several foreign players, but they are not inflated by the market prices that Chinese league crazily would offer to beat the Premier League price tags. I think it's a much more comfortable and healthy makeup of a team between the right players from foreign countries and your local players. And I think in China, for each team, if you have some veteran players, I think the Chinese club are trying to hire and sign and hire relatively younger talents for them to sell them back to Europe for a higher price. That's for commercial return. But for the team itself, the healthy development of the team, you do need veteran players who can help develop the younger Chinese players into a team, just like Mowbray playing for the Beijing basketball team, that he can motivate and lead the players.
Privately or on the social media, I found so many discussions focusing on the issue of one's stamina, energy. Now, to say nothing of Europeans and players from Latin America, our neighbor, South Korea, most of the players could run easily throughout the whole game without showing any signs of fatigue. But look at the Chinese players. Yeah. Why? Do you think it's a matter of a training, or do you think this is a matter of attitude? What's wrong? Is that because of the abusive behavior of the Chinese football players who would love to drink more beer, alcoholic, than discussing seriously what they should do to catch up?
I think the situation on the professional level is also changing, maybe slowly, but improving. I think stamina or physical issue is becoming less and less significant for China. But of course, there are still a lot of bad habits among the Chinese players. Such as smoking, drinking. Yes, it's quite common among professional Chinese players, and because they belong to that generation. And you don't, if people like Rowan can, from the very young age level among Chinese young kids, they are being educated and taught how to perform and how to perform, more professionally and scientifically. I think it will change.
What about the sportsmanship or gamesmanship for European players? I mean, the education of football career should include the decency of being a respectable player, right? You should not come across as a hooligan, as someone who abuses the money simply because you are rich. You can be a womanizer, you could be an excessive drinker of alcoholic. I mean, that's certainly a target of a social criticism, even a target of a crusade against your bad image.
I think things have changed a lot. I think if you went back to the 70s, the 80s, you would see that be the case. There were big drinkers and out partying all the time. I think now it's a very, very different game. They are very controlled by their clubs and by their national teams.
You are talking about discipline of the clubs?
Discipline, as well as training for the players about how to deal with media. Still, you'll get mistakes, of course. You know, young people will be young people, but much different now in terms of their health and their nutrition, in terms of injury prevention. All these areas have had a very big improvement, and these are elite athletes and are very controlled in that way. So I think it probably is less of an issue than before. But I think there is one thing you mentioned, is attitude. You know, I get the impression often watching China, and as an England fan, I have the same feeling over many years, is the frustration and even the anger at the performance of our national team. And I think this puts a huge pressure on the players, and whole generations of England team seemed to fail when it came to the crucial moment, and I think it was a lot to do with the pressure. And I see a very similar thing here with China. In that split moment, I think players are asking whether the Chinese people are behind them, and I think far too often their response will be, oh my God, if I make a mistake here, I'm going to lose face, I'm going to be berated back home.
It's quite true, yeah, I agree. I think there are some interviews revealing that even some national team players, every time they walk onto the pitch, they want to run away.
There's a fear.
Then, again, let me go back to the issue of the Chinese football fan. They've been talking, they show no signs of making a retreat. They would just always be so supportive. They cried many times, they jeered, they taunted the Chinese players each time, but they still refuse to change the support itself. Is that an issue of nationalism? Because some of the Chinese readers and netizens were laughing at South Korea because of their cheerleaders. I mean, the way they show up the morale in the stadium. Can you brief us on the performance of the Chinese spectators in the stadium, as well as, of course, football fans in their millions?
Yes, I think
do they deserve credit for the continuation?
If you calculate those who would stay on their sofa and watch the games live on the TV, China may boast the greatest number, the biggest number of football fans. If you call them fans, watching football, it's because of the demographic situation of China, the biggest population in the world.
By the way, by the end of this program, we're going to...
But for those fans, even they are relatively small compared with the size of the total population, they are still a big crowd compared with their counterparts from other countries.
Okay,
they're quite loyal.
Gentlemen, very quickly, your definition about a good, decent football fan. Very quickly, each of you should be giving us, should give us your version, very quickly. The definition of a football fan.
Yeah, you keep your faith in the sport, and you keep supporting the players who are actually your brothers or even children, and just like the way you treat your own children. Your own children didn't perform very well in their final exam. You don't give them up.
You talk like a mother with regards to the kids. So what's your take?
Well, yeah, surely loyalty has to be the thing, doesn't it? You stay with your team through thick and thin, and you never let them down. I think, possibly for Chinese fans, it should be, what can I do to be involved? If you're a real fan, what was your contribution in this last week for football? Have you helped local football in the schools? Have you helped local clubs? How have you made a contribution towards the Chinese game, rather than just commenting on the social media? If there was 1 yuan for every bad comment about Chinese football from football fans, we would have a lot of money to deal with the problem.
Then probably people of the elder generation would have to make a choice between table tennis and football. That makes a big difference, a sea difference, of course. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.